So I think Andrew Hopkins needs no introduction to the group here, but I have asked Andrew if he would use his research, his knowledge, his perceptions about the OHS professional role to talk to us about the role of knowledge as a conceptual framework to underpin practice. And I welcome Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. It's a pleasure to be here in this truly beautiful environment. It's one of the best lecture theatres I've lectured in, I have to say. Look, I'm paranoid about whether you can hear me. Can you hear me up the back? Is that okay? Good. And the other thing I want to say is I'm going to interpret my topic pretty liberally. I'm going to move away from that, I'm afraid, but I hope not entirely away from that. I want to start by saying that our professional environment is full of concepts that are swirling around us, that are difficult to pin down and difficult to understand. I mean things like safety culture, risk, reasonably practicable, and sense-making. Some of these are fads and really need to be dismissed. Some of them have greater value, but we need to be discerning about them and identify what is of value in those concepts and what is not. As an academic, I have the privilege of having time to think about these things, to reflect about these concepts and work out for myself what my attitude to them is. But practitioners, I know, don't have the luxury of the time that I have, and they are often overwhelmed by these ideas. They feel an obligation to make use of them, to incorporate them into their language without necessarily having had the time to think carefully about them and to be aware of their strengths and weaknesses. And this seems to me to be one of the main virtues of the body of knowledge, that I'm going to call it BOK, if I may. BOK, especially its most recent chapters, deals with some of these popular ideas and highlights the complexities and the contradictions and the ambiguities and identifies what is of value in them. And it seems to me that's what is of value in BOK for many practitioners, to have a handy compendium of what's of value in these ideas and what may need to be discarded. So I want to illustrate what I've been saying by reference to a number of these concepts. Take safety culture. I think the most authoritative definition of safety culture was, and still the most widely quoted, was given in 1991, provided by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And this is what they said. Safety culture is that assembly of characteristics and attitudes which establishes that as an overriding priority, nuclear plant safety receives the attention warranted by its significance, as said in the context of nuclear safety. As an overriding priority. It's only where safety is an overriding priority that we can speak of a safety culture. Now, for most organisations, safety is not the overriding priority. Follows, as a matter of logic, that for most organisations do not have a safety culture. That's a matter of logic. It's very few organisations can claim to have a safety culture using that definition. By the way, those of you who are familiar with James Reason's work will know that that's his definition of safety culture as well, a very restrictive definition. However, the most common usage of safety culture is that all organisations have a safety culture, all of them. It may be a good one, maybe a bad one, but all organisations have a safety culture. So this is in absolute contradiction with that definition that I quoted to you, the most authoritative, not the only definition, but the most authoritative definition. And that contradiction is just one of the many problems which besets the concept of safety culture. So this is why the BOK is so important. And here's what the BOK chapter concludes about safety culture. There is no agreed definition of the term safety culture, no definitive model of safety culture. The literature is large, diverse, fragmented, confusing and ambiguous. There is little evidence supporting a relationship between safety culture and safety performance. In a practical sense, it is fruitless to continue to attempt to define safety culture. Rather than trying to change something as nebulous as safety culture, the focus should shift to changing the organisational and management practices that have an immediate and direct impact on workplace safety. Wow, what a statement that is. If I was a practitioner, I would breathe a sigh of relief when I read that statement. I would say fantastic. I don't need to try and get my head around all the subtleties and the ambiguities and the inconsistencies in this concept. I am going to discard it. I'm going to get right to the heart of the matter, which is organisational and management practices. These are the things which really do affect workplace safety. So that to me is the real value, one of the values of these chapters. It helps us cut through, if I may say, the bullshit to the things which are of lasting benefit and lasting value, and indeed are meaningful. The second concept I want to look at very briefly is risk. This is a very problematic concept. I'm aware of at least three distinct meanings of the word risk. The first one is hazard or hazardous event. Okay, now I think the place where this is most clear is in the Australian Standard on Risk Management. That standard, many of you will be familiar with that standard, doesn't use the word the word hazard anywhere. The word hazard just does not appear in that standard. But obviously it's concerned with the management of hazards. So clearly it's going to be snuck in some way. The fact of the matter is often when that standard talks about risk, not always, but often, it means hazard. So there is indeed a confusion in that very standard between hazard and risk. Now, I'm not sure what the devisers of that standard had in mind, but for us as health and safety people, that's a crucial confusion. That's an absolutely crucial confusion. We make a clear and it's an important distinction between hazard and risk. And if you don't make that distinction, you can get into all kinds of difficulties. I studied, as some of you will know, the Esso Longford gas plant accident in 1998 and the legal proceedings that followed that. And one of the charges against Esso at the time was crippled and made meaningless by the fact that they confused the charge itself, and the court then confused risk and hazard. And the charge was fundamentally nonsense, fundamentally meaningless because of that confusion. Nevertheless, Esso was convicted on that fundamentally meaningless charge and fined, I think it was, $250,000. So this is a very clear example in my mind of the importance of getting those ideas right. I'm not going to give you, if you want the reference to that, I can at a later stage. A second meaning of the word risk that we come across frequently is involved in the use of risk matrices that many of you are familiar with, where risk is, where basically what we're trying to do is evaluate a hypothetical event, and we evaluate it in two dimensions. One is the probability of that event occurring, and the other is the severity of the consequence. So risk in that context is probability times consequence. That's a very common understanding of risk, which is quite different from the first that I've mentioned. And the third meaning is simply probability. That's a really common meaning of the word risk as well. Fatality risk is about probability of fatality. So we have these very different meanings, and most authors seem quite happy to switch from one to the other without a blink, without recognising that they're talking about different things. And it is dreadfully confusing, and the confusion is not our fault as readers or as practitioners. The fault is with those who advocate the use of these concepts and use these concepts without carefully defining what they're talking about. Now, I don't know if the body of knowledge currently deals with those issues. It certainly has a role in so doing, and if it doesn't currently deal with those issues, perhaps that's something for future editions. Third example I want to mention, and this is one that struck me coming out of one of the chapters, was the concept of reasonably practicable. As we all know, most legislation requires duty holders to maintain safety, a safe workplace, so far as is reasonably practicable. What on earth does that mean? If you're a duty holder, what on earth does that mean? Well, the body of knowledge chapter on this answers that question for the duty holder. Here's what it says. In most cases, compliance with relevant codes will be a strong indication that what was reasonably practicable was done. Now that's if I'm a duty holder, I find that a very helpful and reassuring statement. Okay, that if I'm complying with relevant codes, then I'm in reasonably good shape. However, there's a paradox there, isn't there? There really is a paradox, because modern OHS law requires us to get away from prescription, and yet this seems to be a prescriptive solution which is being recommended in the body of knowledge. But the body of knowledge, I think, goes beyond that. If you read it carefully, it will help you to resolve that understand that paradox and resolve that paradox in your own mind. I want to set it up as a paradox because it is something to think carefully about, and the body of knowledge will help you to work through to what that means at the end of the day. And then the final one I want to talk about is the way in which the body of knowledge can help practitioners understand the human contribution to accidents. When I look at the accident analyses that are done by big companies, and I look at a lot of accident investigations, internal accident investigations, they are woefully deficient, aren't they? Anyone who's been involved in looking at these things would have that experience. They typically, not always by any means, but typically they will find a way to blame the frontline worker. Sometimes it's actually the victims themselves who are being blamed, but whether or not the frontline worker is indeed a victim is not the point. It's the frontline worker who is being blamed. I've identified at least 3 different kinds of what I might call blame the worker explanations in the accident reports that I've looked at. First and most common one is carelessness, and that's obviously something for which the worker needs to be condemned. They ought to have been more careful. The words are sometimes a bit more cautious than that, but fundamentally the problem was the worker wasn't being careful enough. Now that's an entirely discredited attitude to all of us here. We know, entirely discredited as an explanation. It's a starting point for an explanation, not an end point. But the other 2 that fall under this heading are a little more subtle, and we need to think a little more carefully about them. Second one I come across is this, that the worker concerned lacked the necessary competence. That's frequently the explanation that I see in accident investigation reports. For whatever reason, and it's not necessarily work's fault, the worker lacked the necessary competence. It's a neutral kind of statement. As I say, it's not in the first instance a worker blaming explanation. However, what's interesting about it is it rapidly is transformed in a subtle way into a worker blaming kind of explanation, because the fact that the worker lacked the necessary competence becomes the worker was incompetent. So this noun is transformed into an adjective. That adjective qualifies the worker. We have an incompetent worker. The worker as a whole is now categorised as incompetent. So it's no longer just a very precise statement. The worker as a whole is somehow incompetent, which, as many of us use that term, is synonymous with stupid. So the worker has been transformed into somebody who's stupid, and that's really why that person is blameworthy. And the third example, again, which I think is a subtle one, we need to think about it, is complacency. And I've seen in very major accident reports put up by regulators as well, that the problem was the complacency of the workforce. And of course, in most people's minds, complacency means laziness, and that's something which is worthy of condemnation. But if you think about complacency, what does it mean? Complacency is actually learnt behaviour. What happens is that workers are told they're meant to comply with certain precautions, and that they learn over time that those precautions are unnecessary. Again and again, time after time, they get by without adopting those precautions, and in the great majority of occasions, nothing happens. So they learn from their own experience that those precautions are unnecessary, and it's only when something goes wrong that a different perspective becomes relevant. The point is, though, that they learn from their own experience, and we know, don't we, that personal experience is the most powerful form of learning. It's far more powerful than book learning, and these people are learning that these precautions, from their own experience, that the precautions are unnecessary. And once we understand that, then the concept of complacency takes on a very different light. No longer is it something for which they need to be condemned. We need a much more careful and more considered response than simply condemning them in that way. So these so-called explanations are really pseudo-explanations, and they are moral evaluations masquerading as explanations. And one of the chapters in the Body of Knowledge provides, I think, a far richer understanding about decision-making in relation to risk, and I would recommend that you look at this. And one of the particular concept that I want to pick out from that chapter is sense-making. I think sense-making is a really useful way to help us understand why people do what they do. And the basic point is that people often do what they do because, first of all, how do they make sense of a situation? This is how they make sense of the situation. And once you understand how they've made sense of the situation, very often that determines how they will act. Very often there's no longer a question of making a decision. The way in which they understand the situation will determine how they act. I've got another minute or so to go. So let me give you one example of that just from my own research, and it concerns an oil company in the US that had a major release of oil into the environment, into a river system. The pipeline ruptured and of course, therefore, the pressure went to zero. At the other end, where the pipeline operators were 1,000 miles away, they could see the pressure had gone to zero on their instruments. So how do they respond? They pumped harder to try and increase the pressure. They were described as incompetent, they were described as stupid, careless by the regulators. But really, why did they behave the way they did? We can only understand this if we understand how they made sense of that situation. How do they make sense of that situation? Well, these pipelines can sometimes, the oil within the pipeline can separate, particularly if the pipeline is going up a hill and then down another hill. The oil may separate on either sides of that point, and you may end up with a large, very large vapor bubble in the pipeline. Now, if that's the case, and you have zero pressure at one end, and you start to apply pressure at the other end, you don't expect to see the pressure rise at this other end first. What you think you're doing is closing up the bubble. And it's only when you've closed up the bubble would you expect to see pressure rise at the other end. And that's what those workers thought they were doing. They thought they were closing up a vapor bubble. So their behaviour was rational in terms of the sense they made of that situation. And that's, I think, a really simple example of why it is so important to get inside the heads of people and understand how they make sense of the situations that they are in. And so just to sum up, I do think the body of knowledge can help practitioners understand the human contribution to accidents much more effectively than is often the case. It also will help them not to be overwhelmed by the many and varied concepts which circulate and which are peddled by all kinds of charlatans, I have to say. But help us to understand those things and be selective about what is of use and what is not of use. Thank you very much.